Stock markets in Dublin, London, Paris and Frankfurt fell today ahead of an expected announcement of tariffs by US President Donald Trump on Wednesday. Taoiseach Micheál Martin said the government is intensifying its engagement with Washington and companies which will be impacted by the taxes.
Stock markets around the world are weaker today. Investors, increasingly nervous about the impact of US tariffs, call it the Trump slump. On Air Force One, the US president indicated those taxes would be applied globally.
You'd start with all countries, so let's see what happens. There are many countries. I haven't heard a rumor about 15 countries, 10 or 15.
So you're starting with all countries?
Essentially, all of the countries that we're talking about, would be talking about.
In Ireland, Taoiseach Micheál Martin said the EU needs to respond strategically.
It will be challenging to try and get a negotiating platform at European level in response to these tariff impositions. First point, Europe doesn't want tariffs. The European Union doesn't. But US seems intent on imposing tariffs with a view to reshoring a lot of manufacturing to the US. That is the stated aim.
It's not yet clear exactly what tariffs are going to be announced on Wednesday, but there are concerns some exports from Ireland could effectively be hit twice. Once with a tariff on goods coming from Ireland, and secondly with a specific tax on pharmaceuticals.
There's also the threat of sectoral tariffs, and they will be imposed on pharmaceuticals, for example, IT, we've seen it on cars, we've seen it on steel, and that's a second tariff which is over and above the universal tariff.
The difficulty for Ireland is that its economy is much more exposed to US exports than any other EU country.
And David joins us now, as does our political correspondent, Micheál Martin. David, to you first. There are some who are fearful that Donald Trump's so-called Liberation Day could cause a global recession. Are those fears well-founded?
Well, if you look at the stock markets, they're down about 10% in the US since Donald Trump was elected to office, despite an initial increase. And one of the reasons for that is a concern about the impact of this trade war. In the first instance, it will put up prices on both sides of the Atlantic. That could result in inflation. It could result in higher interest rates. And all of that affects global economies. And that's why there is that concern which you're referring to. I think the second aspect of this is that while initially the focus will be on Washington this week, then the focus will switch to Brussels, where the response to this is going to be formulated. And it's worth bearing in mind, Ireland is one of a number of EU states. They'll all have different priorities. And the question is, like, something that suits the EU may not necessarily suit each member state, and particularly Ireland with its big exposure, and particularly to US exports and particularly pharmaceuticals.
And let's talk to Micheál Martin now on that, because Micheál, trade is a function of the European Union. So what options does the government here have?
Well, I think it may sound like something from a sporting coaching manual, but the government's new creed does seem to be all about controlling the controllable. And on that end, they are looking at things like investing in the economy and things like water services, energy, public transport and housing. They feel that they could ultimately lower the costs for businesses to make Ireland more competitive and an attractive place for companies to set up. And on that front, when the coalition leaders meet tonight, they will speak also to the Enterprise Minister, Peter Burke. There's also a realisation that the country will have to diversify into other markets quite quickly, and to that end you could see things like the EU-Canada trade deal, the ratification of that coming before the Dáil quite soon. And of course there is the ongoing diplomatic effort which has been happening all day, high-level negotiations involving the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach with their other EU states to try and ensure that Ireland's priorities are also EU priorities in the period ahead.
Micheál Martin from Leinster House and David Murphy here in studio. Thank you both.